These dogs were especially trained with special equipment for their space travel.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
You might be surprised to know that humans were not the first living creatures to orbit the Earth or visit the Moon. Do you know that animals were used as test pilots before humans were sent into space? But why has there been so little excitement and information about our true space heroes? For decades, NASA kept this a secret from the public. Why? Could it be because of the heartbreaking reality of what they did to these animals and their tragic end? Join me as we unveil the dark history of animal experimentation in space travel, how it all started. Before humans went into space, one of the prevailing theories of the perils of spaceflight was that humans might not be able to survive prolonged periods of weightlessness, also known as zero gravity. For decades, there was this serious debate among scientists about the effects of prolonged weightlessness. So, in the meantime, American and Russian scientists decided to experiment with animals, monkeys, chimps, and dogs, to test each country's abilities to launch a living organism into space and bring it back alive and unharmed. Fruit flies were the first animals intentionally launched into space. On February 20th, 1947, these flies were transported aboard a V-2 rocket from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. The rocket flew 67 miles before returning to Earth via parachute. Not until years later did NASA officially recognize the height of 66 miles, or 100 kilometers, as the point where space officially begins. Hence, the fruit flies were the first animals to reach that boundary between the Earth and the outer space. The flies were ideal passengers for the mission because their small size and light weight made it easy to maneuver and reduce fuel consumption. Little was known about the impact of cosmic radiation on organic matter at the time, so fruit flies were chosen for testing and research because they have a similar genetic makeup to humans. Upon the safe recovery of the flies' capsule, the scientists discovered that radiation did not change the genetics of the flies, paving the path for future human spaceflight. On June 11, 1948, a V-2 Blossom launched into space from White Sands, New Mexico, carrying Albert I, a rhesus monkey, and the first animal astronaut. The lack of documentation made Albert an unrecognized hero of his time. On June 14, 1949, a second V-2 flight carrying a live Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory monkey, Albert II, reached an altitude of 83 miles. Albert II became the first monkey in space, but died on re-entry when the parachute to his capsule failed. Two other monkeys, Albert III and IV, also died on their return journey. On August 31, 1950, another V-2 took off, carrying an unanesthetized mouse, but did not survive the impact. On September 20, 1951, a monkey called Yorick and 11 mice were recovered after a 236,000-foot aerobie missile mission at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. Yorick gained quite a lot of notoriety for being the first monkey to survive a space mission. On May 22, 1952, Patricia and Mike, two Filipino monkeys trapped in an aerobie nose section, were fired at a speed of 2,000 miles per hour at Holloman Air Force Base 2. These two monkeys became the first animals to achieve such a great altitude, flying 36 miles up at a speed of 2,000 miles per hour. Mildred and Albert, two white mice, were also on this voyage. They were inside a gently rotating drum in which they could float during the period of weightlessness. The section containing the animals was safely recovered from the high atmosphere. Patricia died a natural death 2 years later, and Mike died in 1967 at the National Zoological Park in Washington, D.C. The Soviets kept close tabs on what the US was doing. They also needed to gather data to design a perfect cabin to carry a human being into space. They eventually decided to use dogs for this phase of testing. Considering the previous failure of monkey testing, they chose dogs over monkeys because they felt that dogs would be less fidgety in flight. In the 1950s, the US and the Soviet Union launched a total of 12 dogs on various flights, 3 of which flew twice. Unfortunately, only a few survived and came back alive. Belka and Strelka, launched on the 19th of August 1960 by the Soviet space program, were the first dogs to return from space alive. 2 months later, Strelka gave birth to 6 puppies, one of which was given to US President John F. Kennedy by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Subsequently, the Soviet Union and the United States launched numerous species of animals into space, including monkeys, mice, and dogs. Nonetheless, these were suborbital flights, meaning the spacecraft flew into outer space before falling back to Earth without completing an orbit. The first animal to orbit the Earth? On November 3, 1957, Sputnik 2 blasted into Earth orbit with a dog named Laika on board. Laika was a little stray dog found on the street. She was quickly trained and put aboard in a metal carrier in Sputnik 2 spacecraft. Sputnik 2 was the second spacecraft ever launched into Earth orbit and the first to carry an animal into orbit. Laika died on the fourth orbit due to overheating caused by an air conditioning malfunction. There was no time to work out any re-entry strategy before passing out a few hours later. Sputnik 2 finally burned up in the outer atmosphere in April 1958. On January 31, 1961, the first hominid, a chimpanzee, was launched into space. The mission's major goal was to set whether scientific tasks could be performed in space. This was a crucial feat to be accomplished before launching humans into space. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to fly in space. He traveled on the Vostok 1 and completed one orbit of the Earth before safely parachuting to Earth. The entire trip from launch to landing took 108 minutes. One would think that after this, testing on animals would be over, but no. Felicity, the first cat in space. On October 18, 1963, French scientists launched their first animal, a cat, into space on a Véronique AGI-sounding rocket. The cat, named Felicity, had electrodes implanted in her head to transmit her condition as she spent 5 minutes in weightlessness. She reached an altitude of 100 miles and landed safely, but was killed 2 months later so that scientists could examine her brain. In 1976, South American guppies became the first fish in space. They spent 48 days in orbit on the Russian Salyut 5 spacecraft. In 1973, a common cross spider named Arabella became the first to spin a web in space, thus answering the question of whether webs can be spun in zero gravity. First animals to orbit the Moon. The first animals to orbit the Moon and return to Earth were two Russian tortoises aboard Zond 5. On the 15th of September 1968, the tortoises were launched with plants, seeds and bacteria and returned to Earth 7 days later. The capsule and its occupants survived re-entry. To date, a total of 32 monkeys have flown into space. These species include rhesus, macaques, squirrel monkeys, and pig-tailed monkeys. Guinea pigs, frogs, cats, wasps, beetles, and a chimpanzee have all flown. Why were animals sent to space before humans? We all know that nothing comes for free or easily. Everything has a price, both success and failure. In like manner, there is a price to pay for every scientific achievement and technological advancement. Unfortunately, this time, the animals paid the price. Back then, space flights involving animals were used to test the possibility of sending humans to space and the potential for survival. Scientists needed to study the effect of radiation and weightlessness on living creatures outside of Earth's protective magnetic field and atmosphere, and doing this on humans will be too costly. For instance, worms exhibit similar changes to humans in the expression of genes that regulate blood sugar. Besides, since worms are more compact and reproduce rapidly, scientists can examine several of them across an entire lifespan, unlike humans. How many animals died in space? There have been so many space missions that involve biological lives, many kept hidden as secrets with no traces of their documentation, which makes it difficult to know precisely how many animals have died in space. Throughout the early years of space exploration, the spaceship design and construction were basically for trials, meaning the animals had little chance of survival. Animals are still transported into space these days. However, the chances of survival are much higher. In 2007, Russian scientists celebrated after a cockroach named Hope became the first creature to conceive in space, giving birth to 33 cockroaches on board a Photon M satellite. Despite the losses, these creatures taught scientists far more than they could have learned without them. Without these animals, in the early days of the human space program, the old Soviet and American missions would have suffered significant losses of human life. These animals did something for their respective countries that no human could or would have done. They sacrificed their lives in the pursuit of technological and scientific advancement, paving the way for humanity's numerous journeys into space. They are indeed our heroes.